Right, so we're taking a deep dive today into this renters' rights bill you've given us, and wow, there's a lot here.
It does seem like quite a bit.
We've got excerpts from the bill itself, like newts explaining it all, even proposed changes. Oh, and snippets from debates in Parliament.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot to go through. But don't worry, we're going to break it down, figure out what it all means, especially for renters like you.
I must say, you've gathered a very impressive collection of materials. This is great. It gives us a really broad perspective.
Well, I knew I was going to need your help to make sense of all this, especially when we're talking about like big changes that could have a ripple effect, you know? Like one of the biggest things here is how the bill changes assured tenancies. Those are the most common type for renters in England, right?
Yes, exactly. And the big change they're proposing is to get rid of fixed terms for these tenancies.
So does that mean they'll all become like, what do they call it, periodic?
Yes, they'll all become periodic tenancies, meaning there's no fixed end date.
So no more like having that date hanging over your head. You could basically stay in your place for as long as you want.
In theory, yes. The aim is to give renters more security, knowing they can't just be evicted when their lease is up.
That sounds great for renters. But I'm guessing some landlords might not be so thrilled about that.
Well, yeah, some landlords are worried they'll lose control over their properties. Like, what if they need the property back for some reason? They're concerned it could make people less willing to rent out properties.
Yeah, I can see that. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, especially that balance between giving renters security and also making sure landlords still feel like they have options, you know?
It's definitely a delicate balance.
And speaking of things that could be a bit controversial, the bill also deals with those no-fault evictions, you know, where landlords can use a Section 21 notice to evict a tenant without giving a reason. But this bill basically gets rid of that, right?
Exactly. No more Section 21. Renters would have more peace of mind knowing they can't be kicked out without a good reason.
And from the debates you gave me, it sounds like this part got pretty heated.
Oh, absolutely. Some MPs were really worried that it would take away a tool landlords need. Like, what happens if you have a tenant who's constantly damaging the property or disrupting everyone else?
So it's not like tenants can just do whatever they want.
Right. The bill does lay out reasons why a landlord could evict someone, but there are rules they have to follow, and they have to give proper notice. So like if you need to sell the place, or if a family member needs to move in, you can still evict a tenant, but there's a process you have to go through.
That makes sense. So it's more about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Protecting renters from unfair evictions, but also giving landlords ways to get their property back if they have a legitimate reason.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance. And another area where the bill tries to make things fair is discrimination.
Okay, yeah, this is where things get interesting. It looks like they're going after discrimination from like all angles, not just who landlords can rent to, but even the language used in those rental ads. It even goes into things like mortgages and insurance contracts. Seems like they're trying to cover all the bases.
Right. And it adds new protected characteristics. So things like whether a tenant has kids or if they're receiving benefits. It would become illegal to discriminate against someone for those reasons.
So like those ads that say no kids or no DSS would be a no-go.
Yeah, those would be out. Even though they might seem harmless, those phrases have been used to shut out entire groups of people. This would put a stop to that.
It's crazy how sneaky discrimination can be. You might not even realize you're being excluded until you really look closely.
You're absolutely right. And the bill also has things in it to deal with discrimination based on other things, like race, religion, sexual orientation, things like that.
So it's really trying to create a more inclusive rental market for everyone. But do you think these parts of the bill will actually work? Are there any loopholes they might have missed?
I mean, that's the big question, right? The bill might have all these protections, but it comes down to how it's actually put into practice.
Yeah, a law is only as good as how well it's enforced. Speaking of which, the bill has some pretty hefty fines for landlords who break the rules. We're talking like £7,000 for some things, and even up to £40,000 for more serious offenses.
Oh, those are definitely meant to be deterrents. They don't want landlords to just ignore the rules.
So it's not just a slap on the wrist. They're serious about this. They want to make sure that discrimination and treating tenants unfairly will have real consequences.
That's definitely the message. And it's not just about fines either. The bill also gives more power to local authorities. They can enforce the rules, issue improvement notices, even ban landlords from renting out properties if they're unsafe.
So they're giving those local authorities some real teeth to deal with bad landlords and protect tenants from living in bad conditions.
Exactly. And to make sure everything's transparent. The bill also makes it so those local authorities have to publicly share information about what they're doing to enforce the rules.
That's good. It's not just about punishing bad behavior, it's also about shining a light on what's happening in the rental market, holding everyone accountable, both landlords and the authorities.
Exactly. It gives renters more information, more power to stand up for their rights.
It's a big change from how things are now, where it often feels like renters are at the mercy of their landlords. This seems to be flipping the script.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The bill is trying to level the playing field, and it's definitely going to change things in the rental market.
This has been really insightful,
Hmm.
but we've only scratched the surface. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dig into how this bill tackles rent increases. That's another big one for renters, right? Okay, so we've talked about more security for renters, but then that makes you wonder, what about rent increases? Landlords still need to, make a living.
Of course, they have costs to cover.
Hmm.
And that's where those amendments you brought up get really interesting. The ones about tying rent increases to that um, consumer price index or
Yeah.
to wage growth, the debates in Parliament about that, those got pretty intense.
Yeah, I was skimming those. So break it down for me. Why were some MPs so insistent on connecting rent increases to those economic indicators?
Well, think about it from a renter's perspective. In lots of places, wages just aren't keeping up with how fast rents are going up. So the idea is if you link rent increases to CPI or wage growth, it's more predictable for the renter. And some would say fairer. It would stop landlords from just jacking up rents because the market's hot.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about making sure rent increases actually reflect what people can afford, but I'm guessing landlords probably had their own arguments against that.
Oh, for sure. They were saying that if you control rents too tightly, it could discourage investment in rental properties. Landlords need some leeway to adjust rents based on what the market's doing so they can cover their expenses and make a reasonable profit.
Right. It's a balancing act. You want to protect renters, but you also don't want to scare away people from being landlords in the first place.
Exactly. And another point that came up in those debates was if you have really strict rent controls, some landlords might start cutting corners on maintenance to make up for the lower rent increases.
Hmm.
So it's that whole unintended consequences thing again.
So what did the bill end up doing? Did it go with the stricter controls or stick with a more market-based approach?
It kind of tries to find a middle ground. Rent increases can only happen once a year, but there isn't a strict formula based on CPI or wages. Instead, it kind of leaves it open for landlords and tenants to work it out. But the idea is any increase has to be reasonable.
So some wiggle room, but within limits. I'm really curious to see how that'll work in practice. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about this private rented sector database. What does that mean for renters, practically speaking?
Think of it as a way to bring more transparency to the whole rental market. It's basically a central place where you can find information about landlords and their properties. So before you sign a lease, you could check it out, see if there are any red flags like, I don't know, past convictions or if they've been fined for something.
So you're not going in blind. You can actually do your research before you commit to living somewhere.
Exactly. Being informed is so important, especially when it comes to where you're going to live. And it's not just for individual renters. Local authorities can use this database too. Spot trends, figure out where they need to focus their efforts, make sure landlords are playing by the rules.
So it gives them a better overview, helps them be more proactive. But are there any concerns about a database like this?
Well, privacy is a big one, right? The bill does say they'll have data protection measures in place, but those need to be really strong, and they need to keep up with the times. Otherwise, people aren't going to trust it. There's also the issue of making sure the information in the database is actually accurate. If it's full of mistakes, it's not going to be very helpful. And then there's the whole practical side of it, making sure all the landlords actually register and keep their information up to date.
So it has the potential to be really useful, but there are definitely things that could go wrong. It sounds like we'll need to keep an eye on how it all plays out. But let's move on to enforcement. The bill gives local housing authorities more power to make sure landlords follow these new rules, right?
Right. We talked about the fines already, but they can also issue what are called improvement notices. That means the landlord has to fix specific problems in the property within a certain amount of time.
So say a landlord's been putting off fixing that leaky roof, the local authority can step in and make them do it.
Yeah, exactly. And if they ignore the notices, or if a property is just really dangerous for tenants, they can issue something called a prohibition order. that basically bans the landlord from renting out the property until they fix the problems.
It's about making sure those protections in the bill actually mean something, actually improve things for renters. But when you give more power to anyone, you got to be careful, right? What are some of the concerns about these stronger enforcement powers?
One thing people worry about is that it'll create more bureaucracy for landlords, especially the ones who are already doing things right. Some people think the fines are too high and that the threat of banning someone from renting out their property is too extreme.
Right, it goes back to that balance. You want to protect renters, but you don't want to make it impossible for good landlords to operate. And it brings up another issue, consistency.
Yeah, that's a big one. What if some local authorities are really strict while others aren't? It's that whole postcode lottery problem. You don't want your level of protection to depend on where you live.
That's a great point. It needs to be fair for everyone, no matter where they're renting. So we've covered a lot. Assured tenancies, those no-fault evictions, rent increases, the database, and now these enforcement powers. It's a lot to take in, and it really makes you think about the future of renting in the UK.
It's definitely complex, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there are no easy answers here. This bill is trying to fix some deep-rooted problems in the rental market, but it's also a step into the unknown. We don't know exactly how it's all going to play out.
And that's what makes it so interesting. We're potentially seeing a big shift in how renting works in this country. But before we get too carried away with all the what-ifs, let's take a minute to just summarize what this all means for landlords and tenants. Okay, so let's try to sum up everything we've learned about this renters' rights bill. It's been a lot, but I think it's safe to say it's a pretty big deal, right? A real attempt to give renters more, say, make things fairer.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It really tackles some of the biggest issues that have been frustrating renters for years,
Mm.
like those no-fault evictions, discrimination, not knowing if your rent's going to suddenly skyrocket, and this lack of accountability for landlords who just don't take care of their properties.
So for our listeners out there, what are the key things to keep in mind? Let's start with what this means for, well, the renters.
Well, I think the biggest thing is it really does strengthen your rights, give you more security, knowing you can't just be kicked out for no reason. Like we said, those no-fault evictions, those are gone. And it makes it illegal to discriminate against you just because you have kids or you're on benefits.
So no more of those no DSS signs in the windows.
Exactly. And it goes beyond that. It tries to stop discrimination in all its forms. The goal is to make the whole rental market more inclusive so everyone has a fair shot at finding a decent place to live.
Sounds like a huge step forward for renters. But what about the landlords? What do they need to know about all this?
Well, they need to make sure they understand the new rules, things like that database we talked about, and the fact that local authorities have more power now. They have to stay informed, make sure they're doing everything by the book.
Yeah, no more pleading ignorance. Landlords really have to do their homework now. But beyond just the legal side of things, it feels like this bill is also part of a bigger shift,
Yeah.
like how we think about renting in general.
Oh, absolutely. It's moving away from that old idea that renting is just a temporary thing until you can buy a place. It recognizes that for lots of people, renting is their long-term housing situation, and it deserves to be treated with respect.
And that changes things for both sides, really. Tenants can expect more, demand better treatment, and landlords have to adapt, focus on building good relationships with their tenants.
Right. It's about moving away from that us versus them mentality and towards something that's more, well, cooperative, where everyone benefits.
It all sounds really promising, but we have to be realistic. We talked about some of the potential problems, those unintended consequences. Do you really think this bill will achieve what it sets out to do?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, it's a bold move.
Yeah.
And whether it works depends on a lot of things. How well it's implemented, how consistently it's enforced, and maybe most importantly, whether both landlords and tenants are willing to embrace these changes, work together to make the system better.
So it's not just about the law itself. It's about changing attitudes, building a culture of respect and fairness in the rental market.
Exactly. And that's where you, our listeners, come in. Stay informed, talk about these issues, hold everyone accountable, landlords and policymakers alike. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your rights as a renter.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the Renters' Rights Bill. Thanks again for bringing all these sources. It's been great to really unpack this with you.
The pleasure's all mine. I always enjoy getting into the nitty-gritty of housing policy and thinking about how it impacts people in the real world.
We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. If you want to learn more, I definitely encourage you to check out the full text of the bill and those parliamentary debates we mentioned. They're a real eye-opener.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep the conversation going. Ask questions. Stay curious. Let's all work together to build a better rental market for everyone.
We truly appreciate you tuning in to this podcast. Your time and support mean the world to us. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on future content. And if you found value in what we shared, we'd love for you to leave a review or share it with a friend. It helps us grow and keep bringing you amazing episodes. Stay connected, stay curious, and we'll catch you in the next one. Until then, keep listening and keep exploring. Jardim, thank you. Podcast community. Subscribe now.